A couple of thank yous. First to the James Irvine Foundation. This event is part of what we call the James Irvine Foundation Briefing Series. We should thank James Irvine Foundation for the free lunch and for this series. Also, the Irvine Foundation was supportive of this particular survey that we're going to hear about today. So a thank you for both of those supports. And some upcoming events. On June 6th, right after the primary, we're going to have an event with a panel discussion looking at voter turnout issues, which should be very timely, considering that we may very well see a low turnout or perhaps a record low turnout in the primary. And so we'll look at, we'll have a panel discussion and a new report by PPIC about voter turnout. We also have a report that just came out a couple days ago about online education in higher ed, looking at especially at community colleges and how online education is working. And we scheduled an event for May 28th, and we're going to move that later, so that's going to be postponed. But the report is out there, and we will be rescheduling that and putting together a panel discussion to talk about that issue, which is also very timely. This is being taped for broadcast, so if you want to avoid an embarrassing moment, you might silence your cell phone. And with that, I think that's it. I'm going to introduce our presenter, and then after he gives a presentation, I'll come up and we'll do a Q&A with the audience as well. So please welcome Dean Bonner, Research Associate and the manager of the particular survey we're about to hear from today. So welcome, Dean. Thank you.
Got worried there for a second. I thought he forgot my name. I would like to echo Dave's sentiment about filling out the evaluation forms. That's something that we really take seriously and really appreciate the input that you guys are able to give us as we move forward with events and with the survey as well. So prior to discussing this month's survey, I want to talk for a little bit about the PPIC statewide survey more generally. The mission of the statewide survey is to provide timely, relevant, nonpartisan data on political, social, and economic opinions that we hope will inform and improve state policy making, raise awareness, and encourage discussion. Since 1998, we have completed over 130 surveys and given a voice to over 290,000 Californians. This particular survey is the 62nd in the Californians in Their Government series, which, as Dave mentioned, is funded through the generous support of the James Irvine Foundation. In this survey, we examined the state budget, including the governor's revised budget proposal, as well as the rainy day fund planned. We also looked at fiscal issues, approval ratings, and political trust at both the state and federal levels. The survey examines attitudes towards federal health care reform and looks at climate change and energy policy. We interviewed 1,700 Californians on both landline and cell phones, and that was from May 8th to 15th, and the margin of error for all adults is 3.6%. We also have in our survey just over 1,000 people who we consider those most likely to vote, and the margin of error for that is 4.6%. And as Dave mentioned, this turnout could be a little lower than a normal election, so we also have a primary likely voter. And we had just over 900 of those, and the margin of error for primary likely voters is 4.9%. So with that, let's go ahead and begin. So Governor Brown's approval continues to hover around 50%. It's been around 50% for about the last 18 months, with the lone exception, that spike in January, that higher number in January, which was 58%, and that was a record high for the governor. Prior to 2013, about 4 in 10 Californians approved of his performance throughout 2012 and most of 2011. The legislature today has the approval of 4 in 10 Californians, and this is consistent with findings from about the last 6 months. Approval of the legislature today is higher than it was in 2012, and much higher than ratings they received from 2009 to 2011. We also asked about the approval of respondents' individual legislators in their Senate and Assembly districts, and we find that about 4 in 10 Californians and likely voters approve of the state legislator representing their Assembly and Senate districts. And this number is similar to January, and it seems as though that the impact of the 3 suspended Democratic state legislators have been minimal when we look at approval ratings, because they pretty much hovered around 40% for a while there. So we'll continue to monitor that as we go forward as well. So Californians continued to be guarded in their views when it comes to the direction and economic outlook of the state. On both measures, Californians are as likely to be pessimistic as optimistic. However, this is an improvement from the depths of the Great Recession. Since January 2013, the positive perceptions of direction and economic future have been about 40%. Prior to that, from 2008 to 2012, fewer than 4 in 10 held these positive perceptions. And in fact, positive perceptions didn't eclipse 30% from 2008 through the end of 2011. So while it's not that high, it's still much higher than what we've seen in recent years. So we know that in California, voters at the ballot box make a lot of major tax and spending decisions. And this includes, of course, Proposition 30, which was recently passed. And this November, voters will be asked to go to the polls to vote on the newly agreed upon bipartisan rainy day fund, as well as possibly a water bond. So this begs the question, do Californians think they're knowledgeable about budget and fiscal issues? Our survey finds that half of Californians say they know a lot or some about how state governments raise and spend money, with only 14% saying they know a lot. Among those we consider most likely to vote, 7 in 10 say they're at least somewhat knowledgeable, with 18% saying that they know a lot about this. So that dovetails very nicely with the fact that, as I mentioned, our voters are asked to go to the polls to decide on these issues. And in fact, California voters and California adults, regardless of how knowledgeable they think they are, they really want to have a say when it comes to tough budget decisions. 3 in 4 Californians and likely voters have held this view each time we've asked this question. And we also find that strong majorities across regions and demographic groups prefer that California voters have a say in these budget decisions. Preferences for having a say, as I mentioned, is held regardless of whether or not people think they know a lot about fiscal issues or whether or not they know nothing about fiscal issues. So Californians really like being able to go to the polls and have a say, especially on these important budget issues. So 36 years after the passage of Proposition 13, and as state legislators look to possibly tweak part of it, Californians continue to say that it has been mostly a good thing for California. Findings today are similar to almost every other time we've asked this question, with the exception of May 2005, when fewer than half held this view. Likely voters hold roughly similar opinions as they have each time we've asked these questions. Likely voters tend to have just a little bit more favorable opinion than all adults. When we look across parties, we find that Republicans are far more likely than Democrats or independents to say it's been a good thing. But pluralities across regions and at least half across demographic groups think that Proposition 13 has mostly been a good thing. So it's a pretty pervasive and widespread opinion. So transitioning from views of Proposition 13 to attitudes towards raising taxes, we asked Californians about 4 possible tax increases. Californians, as they have in the past, are in favor of increasing taxes on the purchase of cigarettes and on the purchase of alcohol. They are divided, as they were last March, on the question of whether or not we should tax the extraction of oil and natural gas. And when it comes to the California vehicle license fee, Californians remain opposed to any increase in that, as they have in every survey that we've asked this question dating back to 2003. We find that at least half of Democrats and independents favor increasing taxes on alcohol and cigarettes, as well as taxing the extraction of oil and natural gas. Republicans only favor increasing taxes on cigarettes, and across all three political groups, we find very few that would want to raise the VLF. In fact, fewer than 1 in 3 across regions and demographic groups say they favor raising the vehicle license fee. So as we do in most of our May surveys in advance of the May revise, we asked about how people perceive the state budget situation today. And while the budget situation appears to be less daunting, half of Californians still view it as a big problem, with another 4 in 10 viewing it as somewhat of a problem. And while pessimism is still high, it has declined quite a bit from levels reached during earlier years at the height of the budget crisis. During that time, we found that more than 7 in 10 were consistently calling the budget a big problem, and we reached actually a record high of 81% saying the budget was a big problem in May of 2010. So 4 years later, California's perceptions are definitely still pessimistic, but not near kind of on the level that they were. And today, we find that Republicans are far more likely to call the budget situation a big problem compared to Democrats and independents. And so while Governor Brown's revised budget plan has mostly received positive reviews, one issue that's sure to be contentious during budget negotiations is what to do with the state's projected budget surplus. The governor's budget plan uses these funds to pay down state debt and build up the reserve, but others have called for these funds to be used to restore social service programs that were cut in recent years. Californians are divided on this issue. However, 57% of likely voters say that they would prefer to use these funds to pay down state debt. As you might expect, there's a wide partisan divide on this issue, with 6 in 10 Democrats preferring the restoration of social service funding, and 3 in 4 Republicans, along with half of independents, preferring to pay down state debt. There's also a gender gap on this issue, with half of men on the side of paying down state debt and building up the reserve, while half of women are on the side of restoring social service funding. So speaking of the governor's revised budget plan, the governor released his plan for the next fiscal year, his revision of his January plan in the next fiscal year, on May 13th. We were already in the field during that time, but we were able to ask respondents during the last 3 nights of our polling what they thought of his plan. His revised plan, which is largely similar to his January proposal, calls for increased spending on K-12 and higher education, as well as Medi-Cal. It proposes modest increases in spending on prisons and corrections and on health and human services, increases contributions to CalSTRS, the state's teacher retirement system, and allocates money for drought-related expenditures. The plan, as I mentioned, also calls for $11 billion to pay down state debt and $1.6 billion to be put into the rainy day fund, and it includes no new taxes. When we read a brief description of the plan, we find that 3 in 4 Californians, 7 in 10 likely voters, and at least 6 in 10 across party groups favor his plan. His plan is also favored by strong majorities across regions and demographic groups. Before the release of his May revise, we were asking a question which was very similar to our January question based on his January proposal, and the numbers during that time period when we asked about it were very similar to his May revise. So as I mentioned, there's a recently agreed upon bipartisan rainy day fund, and this was agreed upon just days before we went into the field to start our survey. So this plan includes setting aside 1.5% of general fund revenues each year and any capital gains revenues that exceed 8% of the general fund. For the first 15 years, half of this money will go to pay off debt. And the plan also sets limits on how funds may be withdrawn during an economic downturn. When we read a brief description of the plan, 3 in 4 Californians and likely voters, as well as more than 2 in 3 across political groups, are in favor. Once again, strong majorities across regions and demographic groups favor the plan. So the governor has overwhelming support when it comes to both his May revise as well as the rainy day fund that they were able to agree on. So in light of the 3 suspended state senators, we wanted to gauge political trust at the state level. And we find that 2 in 3 Californians say they can trust the state government in Sacramento to do what is right only some or none of the time, while 30% say they can be trusted just about always or most of the time. However, we really can't say that's because of the scandals that had occurred at the state level, because we found that more than 6 in 10 Californians have expressed distrust in periodic surveys dating all the way back to 2002. So this is something that has been with us for quite a long time and isn't a new thing at all. So distrust is even higher when we look at the group who we consider most likely to vote and go to the polls. We find that Republicans are more likely than Democrats or independents to express distrust, and at least 6 in 10 across regions and demographic groups say that government can be trusted only some or none of the time. So this is the first of our trust questions. We always ask these as a set of 3, and the second of which gets at state government waste. And so while there is general distrust in government, we find that Californians also express distrust when it comes to fiscal matters. We find just under half of Californians and about half of likely voters think that the state government wastes a lot of the taxpayer money. Today marks for the first time since January 2002, however, that fewer than half say that a lot of taxpayer money is wasted among Californians. 7 in 10 Republicans think that a lot of taxpayer money is wasted, while fewer independents and Democrats hold this view. In a separate question, we also asked about the impact of big interest on state government. And we found that 6 in 10 Californians and 2 in 3 likely voters say the government is run by a few big interests looking out for themselves rather than for the benefit of all the people. So these 3 questions taken together show that Californians and likely voters are expressing consistently high levels of distrust in state government, which may link back to why they feel like they want to have a say when it comes to the budget decisions at the ballot box. So in the midst of a severe drought and with summer approaching, we find a record high share of Californians saying that the water supply in their part of the state is a big problem. This marks a slight increase from March, but a sizable increase from earlier years when this question was asked. A majority of residents across regions view their water supply as a problem, except in the Inland Empire, where 47% hold this view. We also asked a question about how closely people are following news about drought emergencies, and we find that 2 in 3 Californians are following news either fairly or very closely. So this is something that's definitely grasped the attention of Californians, not only in their perceptions, but also in the things that they're doing. So following up on a question that we asked in March about general water use, we wanted to gather whether Californians were using less water on indoor activities and less water on outdoor activities, which water experts say is really driving the use of water in California. In both cases, most Californians say they're using less, with about 4 in 10 saying that they're using a lot less. Strong majorities across parties, regions, and demographic groups say they're using less water. It's interesting that when we asked people about the outdoor water use, we had to account for people like myself in San Francisco who have no access or aren't responsible for outdoor space. And we find that about 1 in 4 Californians say they have no outdoor space or aren't responsible for the outdoor space. So as you're trying to, to influence people to use less water, this is, the fact that 1 in 4 Californians aren't really responsible for what happens outside, which is where the majority of the water use is from, that speaks to more than educating people, educating organizations and communities when it comes to using less water. So looking ahead to the June gubernatorial primary, we find that Governor Brown has the support of 48% of primary likely voters, and he continues to lead his 2 Republican counterparts, Tim Donnelly and Neil Kashkari. Since April, support for Governor Brown has been largely unchanged, while Tim Donnelly saw his support increase from 9% to 15% today, while Neil Kashkari's support increased from 2% to 10% today. We find that 8 in 10 Democrats support Governor Brown, while Republicans are divided, with 30% supporting Donnelly and 21% supporting Kashkari, with 34% unsure of who they'll vote for. That's a big change from our April survey when we found that 58% were unsure who they were going to vote for. But it's important to note that 1 in 4 primary likely voters are still unsure who they're going to vote for, and that includes 1 in 3 Republicans and independents. So the final 2 weeks of the primary race should be quite compelling. Across regions, pluralities support Brown, except in the Inland Empire and Orange San Diego, where they're as likely to be unsure of who they will vote for as they are to support Governor Brown. So less than a month before the June primary, only 46% of primary likely voters say they're following news about the candidates either very or fairly closely. If you recall just now, I said that 2 in 3 were following news about the drought emergencies very or fairly closely. So Californians are definitely more in tune with what's happening with the drought than they are with the candidates for governor at this time. And as you can see, compared to May of 2010 and May of 2006, far fewer people are paying attention today. We find that half of Democrats report following news, while 4 in 10 Republicans report doing so. It's also important to note that in both May 2006 and 2010, about 2 in 3 across parties said that they were following news either very or fairly closely. And so there's definitely not as close of attention being paid. And one possible reason for the lack of attention could be the fact that only half of primary likely voters say that they are satisfied with their candidate choices. However, satisfaction has increased 11 points since March. We find that Democrats are more satisfied, with 2 in 3 saying that they're satisfied, compared to fewer than half of independents and Republicans. For those who are wondering how satisfaction relates to vote choice, we find that 46% of those who are not satisfied with their choices of candidates are unsure at this point who they're going to vote for. So this satisfaction does relate back to candidate choices. So now I'll move on to the federal government and some questions we asked there. And today we find that the approval of President Obama matches his record low of 51%, first reached in December 2013, which was right after the government shutdown. Approval of Congress has rebounded slightly from its record low in March and is currently at 24%. As you might expect, and once again, and you may get tired of hearing this, there's a partisan divide on this issue, on approval, with 8 in 10 Democrats approving and 8 in 10 Republicans disapproving. Independents are divided on the president's approval, which is a change from earlier years where they fell more on the side of approval than disapproval. When we look at approval of Congress across parties, we find that more than 7 in 10 Democrats, Republicans, and independents disapprove of their job performance. Californians offer, on both the presidential approval and congressional approval, Californians do, however, offer more positive ratings than Americans nationwide. We also ask, as we did at the state level, about individual respondents and their representatives to the House of Representatives. And we found that just under half of Californians and likely voters approve of the job performance, with Democrats being far more likely than Republicans or independents to say they approve of their individual House of representative. So with Congress locked in partisan gridlock, we also wanted to gauge trust at the federal level. Californians continue to be distrustful of the federal government, with 7 in 10 saying they can trust the federal government only some or none of the time, and just 1 in 4 saying they can trust it just about always or most of the time. If you're keeping score, they're more distrustful of the federal government than they are of the state government, which kind of says something. Distrust is not new at the federal level either, however, and at least 6 in 10 Californians have expressed distrust since 2002 once again. Distrust is common across parties, and we find that 2 in 3 Democrats are distrustful compared to 9 in 10 Republicans and 8 in 10 independents. Distrust is quite pervasive, with more than 6 in 10 across regions and demographic groups saying that they can trust the federal government only some or none of the time. So once again, this isn't just certain groups that are driving distrust, it's high across the board. Once again, as was the case at the state level, distrust extends to fiscal matters as well. When it comes to the federal government waste, nearly 6 in 10 Californians think that people in federal government waste a lot of taxpayer money. And at least half of Californians have said that a lot of taxpayer money is wasted in periodic surveys dating back to 2004. Today, this perception is even more prevalent among likely voters. And while more than half across parties say the federal government wastes a lot of taxpayer money, Republicans are far more likely than independents or Democrats to hold this view. Once again, we wanted to ask respondents about the impact of special interest on the federal government. And as we did in the case at the state level, we find that 7 in 10 Californians and 8 in 10 likely voters say that the federal government is pretty much run by a few big interests looking out for themselves rather than for the benefit of all the people. So once again, the picture at the federal level with distrust is similar, although heightened compared to the state level. So turning to one of the more contentious issues at the federal level, the 2010 healthcare law, we find that Californians continue to be divided, as they have been since we first asked this question in December 2013. And in a previous question before December 2013, they were also divided on their perceptions of the healthcare law. Across parties, once again, as you may expect, 7 in 10 Democrats hold a favorable opinion of the law, while more than 7 in 10 Republicans have an unfavorable opinion. Among those who remain insured, about half view the law unfavorably, while about half of those who currently have insurance view the healthcare law favorably. When we compare the state to the national level, Adults Nationwide and the Kaiser Family Foundation poll recently found that adults nationwide view the law less favorably than Californians in our survey. So when it comes to California's health insurance exchange, Covered California, just over half of Californians say it has been working very or fairly well, and about 1 in 3 say it has been working not too or not at all well. In a similar question in January, slightly fewer Californians gave positive reviews of the state's healthcare exchange. Partisans are once again divided, with 7 in 10 Democrats saying it's working well, and half of Republicans saying it's working not too or not at all well. Once again, there's a divide between those with and without insurance. Those who remain uninsured are divided on Covered California, while a majority of those with health insurance give it positive marks. One group, the younger adults in California, were a focus of a concerted outreach effort to get more younger people to sign up. And we find today that Californians are much more likely than older Californians to say that the state's health insurance exchange is working well. So we also wanted to look at some issues which we looked at last May revolving around climate change and energy policy. And on the heels of the third National Climate Assessment report, which described many of the effects of climate change already underway, we find that 6 in 10 Californians think that global warming will pose a serious threat to them and their family in this lifetime. A similar 57% held this view last May, but this perception has grown 16 points since July 2003. Likely voters are less pessimistic about the impact of climate change than all adults. And once again, there's a large partisan divide here, with 7 in 10 Democrats saying that climate change will impact their lives and 7 in 10 Republicans saying that it will not. Across regions, 2 in 3 residents in the San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles say climate change will pose a threat, while fewer residents elsewhere hold this view. We also find that strong majorities of Latinos and those under age 55 see a threat from climate change, while about half of whites and older residents see a threat. So with a possible moratorium on fracking being discussed in California, we wanted to look at how Californians view the possibility of increased use of fracking. As they have in previous surveys, fewer than half of Californians favor increased use of fracking, and support for fracking has declined each time we have asked this question since last May. Half of Republicans favor the increased use of fracking, while more than 6 in 10 Democrats and independents oppose it. Opposition to increased fracking is highest in Los Angeles at 62% and lowest in the Empire at 45%. But in no region does a majority favor increased use of hydraulic fracturing or fracking. Another contentious issue at the national level has been the building of the Keystone XL pipeline that would transport oil from Canada through the Midwest to refineries in Texas. A decision on the pipeline was expected this summer. However, the U.S. Department of State has delayed its decision, and now appears as though a decision won't be coming until after the November election. And while Californians are more likely to favor the Keystone XL pipeline than they are to support increased fracking, fewer than half are in favor of building the pipeline. As you may expect, strong majorities of Republicans are in favor, while half of Democrats are opposed, and independents are divided on this issue. Support has declined somewhat since last May, when 53% were in favor of building the pipeline. Nationwide, a Pew Research Center survey in March found that 6 in 10 adults nationwide were in favor of building the pipeline. So as we've come out of the Great Recession, we've tried to look at the issues of income inequality and poverty. This is especially important with the EPIC caucus that's going on here in Sacramento, revolving around what the state can do about poverty. And in this survey, as we have in previous surveys, we find that large majorities are saying that that poverty is a big problem in our society. And today, 68% say that poverty is a big problem. That's an 11-point increase from 8 years ago when we asked this question in January 2006. Overwhelming majorities across parties, regions, and demographic groups, however, do consider poverty a problem, at least somewhat of a problem, I should say, with about 6 in 10 or more across groups calling it a big problem. We also find a gender gap on this issue, with 3 in 4 women calling poverty a big problem compared to 6 in 10 men who hold this view. So while there is agreement when it comes to how big of a problem poverty is in our society, there isn't as much agreement when it comes to what impact government policies and programs can have in reducing poverty. So today we find that just under half of adults and 4 in 10 likely voters say that these policies can do a lot to reduce poverty in our society. half of Democrats say that policy can do a lot to reduce poverty, while just 3 in 10 Republicans hold this view. And in fact, 1 in 3 Republicans say that these policies do not do much or nothing to reduce poverty. We also find a divide across income groups, where about half of those with incomes under $80,000 saying that policies matter a lot, while about 4 in 10 more affluent Californians hold this view. Adults nationwide in a January poll from the Pew Research Center offered similar opinions to those of Californians in our survey. So once again, with the suspension of the 3 senators in mind, we wanted to kind of gauge how people are viewing political parties. And so we did this by using some questions that we've asked in the past and that are used at the national level, by reading a phrase to a person and asking them, which party and its leaders does this better describe, the Republican Party and its leaders or the Democratic Party and its leaders? And so when read, the phrases govern in an honest and ethical way, or is more concerned with the needs of people like me, Californians by a 2-to-1 margin say that these phrases better describe the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. On these 2 questions, partisans are more likely to say that their own party is better described by these phrases, which you would expect. However, more Democrats say that it describes the Democratic Party than Republicans say it describes the Republican Party. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there. On 2 other phrases, when they're read, is more extreme in its positions or is more influenced by lobbyists and special interest, Californians by smaller margins say these phrases better describe the Republican Party than the Democratic Party. And on these 2 questions, you might expect that partisans are more likely to name the other party as this phrase better capturing. And again, in these cases, more Democrats say the Republican Party than Republicans say the Democratic Party on these issues. And in each case, when we look at the national findings from Pew, the findings largely mirror those of our findings, although at the national level they aren't quite as, not extreme, but they're not quite to the levels as we saw in California, especially on the first 2 phrases, where by a 2-to-1 margin, they say the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. So now just to wrap up before Dave comes up to give some of his thoughts, we find that 3 in 4 Californians say that voters should make some of the decisions at the ballot box. And if you recall, I said it doesn't matter how they view themselves, as whether they view themselves as very knowledgeable or having little to no knowledge. Californians are divided on what to do with the budget surplus, but we do find that 57% of likely voters side with the governor in saying that that these funds should be used to pay down debt and restore and build up the reserve. 3 in 4 Californians and likely voters favor the governor's revised budget plan and the bipartisan rainy day fund. We find that a record share of Californians are saying that the water supply in their region is a big problem, and 2 in 3 are following news about the drought emergency fairly or very closely. Californians are still divided on health care reform, and about half say that covered California is working very or fairly well. We find that a slim majority oppose the increased use of fracking, once again, as people in Sacramento try to, or are discussing the idea of a moratorium. And we found that 2 in 3 Californians are viewing poverty as a big problem in our society, and that's an 11-point increase from our January 2006 survey. So at this time, I'll ask Dave to come up and give some of his thoughts, and then we'll open the floor up to questions.
Just a couple quick things before we open it up. I'm a former LA Times political writer, so I always love to throw in my 2 cents in when I see a poll, especially in an election year. And that's where most of the media coverage has been. There's a lot in this poll, obviously, a lot of very interesting findings on a wide variety of topics. On the political context, I think there's 3 things that stood out to me. One is the state appears fairly divided on some very important perceptions. The right track, wrong track is almost half the state says right track, half says wrong track. On the paying down debt versus restoring budget cuts, it's almost half and half. And so that, I mean, that there's still a lot of anxiety in the electorate, obviously. Second thing, that it looks like, you know, Brown appears to benefit somewhat from his frugal approach with the rainy day fund and his budget proposal. And then just lastly, a lot of attention on the Republican primary for governor, and you know, it just looks like it's wide open. It's, you know, to have 10 and 15% is not much to be able to tell what's happening, and there's still a quarter of the electorate is undecided, and a third of the Republican Party is undecided, and you know, I think a third of the independents are undecided as well. And I mean, the one number that stuck out to me was Kashkari is only pulling 8% of independents, which, you know, you would think that might be a natural base for him. So it'd be interesting to watch where independents go in this race. So with that, why don't we open it up to questions?
Yeah. And if you have a question, just raise your hand, and then we can wait for a microphone as well, yeah, so that we can capture it on the broadcast.
Yeah, the questions that you ask regarding likely voters, so you have your all adults group and then you have your likely voter group. I'm assuming you ask a series of questions to determine how people fall into that likely voter category. Do you break that down by party affiliation as well? That is, if I looked at your crosstabs, could I see X% of Democrats are likely voters, X% of people identifying as Republicans and independents are going to be likely voters? Is that in there? And does that, and two-part question, does that methodology for determining likely voters versus all adults, does that change by election or by election type, say primary versus general, or elections going on over time?
Yeah, so to address the first question, so our likely voter model is based on registered voters first and foremost. You have to be registered to be a likely voter. And it depends on length of residence, voting behavior in the past, as well as a few other questions that we ask to gauge interest. Regarding a partisan breakdown, it's not in the survey itself, but if we come up after, I can grab your email and I'll be able to email that to you. Regarding the different types of likely voters, in this survey we talk a lot around the election regarding primary likely voters. So these are some extra filters that we put into our likely voter model to try to parse out those people that are more likely to vote in a primary, because we know from just looking at voter turnout that the types of people that vote in a June primary are different than the types of people that vote in the November election. So we feel it's very important to have a special set of people that we feel are most likely to vote in the primary election. Yes. Yes. Yes.
I just wanted to go back to the slides where we looked at the optimism or lack thereof. Did anything in your demographics indicate who was feeling more optimistic and who was more concerned?
Are you talking about the right track, wrong track question, or the good times, bad times?
There was a pie chart. There were two pie charts.
State trust?
I thought we had some slides on people's levels of optimism.
The two pie charts that we had were on.
It was right at the beginning.
Yes. That's what I get for trying to be technological. So, so these pie charts is what you mean?
No, maybe I was hallucinating.
It could have been the state trust question, which was that most people are distrustful of government.
It's the right track, wrong track.
Okay, so when it comes to the right track, wrong track, there isn't, I mean, it's a pretty divided sample, and we could talk a little bit more about who falls on what side. I don't really know exactly where those fall, but, you know.
Yeah, I had Democrats were 61% right track,
Yeah.
Republicans 24% right track, and independents 40% right track. So there is a pretty big partisan difference on whether things are going right or not.
Right.
That answers my question. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And here?
My question is along the same lines of hers about wrong track, right track. In your crosstabs, and forgive me for not being able to look at them before I come over, did you notice a difference in geographic regions? We know that the economic recovery is very different on the coast as it is in the Inland Valley or San Joaquin Valley. So I wanted to see if you saw that.
Yeah. I don't want to misspeak, but if you want to come up after, we could talk a little bit about that, because I do have my crosstabs with me, and so we can refer to that. But I hate to say something and it's not correct. Any more questions? Yes.
Have you thought about validating the drought usage questions about how much people are reporting they're reducing their usage versus actual water usage to see if people are being honest and how much they're reporting?
Yeah, that's something that we've thought about, but I guess there is somewhat of a lag when it comes to water use and, versus, what people are saying. But that is an issue that our folks, our water folks at PPIC have been doing a lot of work about the drought and actual looking at water use statistics. So I would keep an eye on some of the works coming from Ellen Hannock and Jeff Mount at the San Francisco office. So, yeah.
Hi, is there any place in your questions for Californians' interest in long-term investment in its infrastructure versus the short-term issues that occur year to year? And what I'm thinking is new big investment and old big investment. Old big investment being water supply, transportation infrastructure, new big investment being sustainability, direction, and the high-speed trains and other sorts of things. So what's our tolerance as Californians for long-term strategies and real investment, not just talk about it, versus managing our existing infrastructure and then that challenged against our short-term desires?
Yes, that's not something we addressed in this survey, but we have in the past in some of our Californians in the Future surveys, where we look at kind of the longer term trend, what people's views are of things approaching before 2025 comes about. And so there are some questions there about infrastructure, and there were some, we've asked about high-speed rail in the past, about the, favor or oppose building it, as well as how important it is to the economic life and vitality of the state, as well as if you go back a little bit further, we've asked about some of the infrastructure bonds that were being discussed, and so, but in this survey in particular, given that it was so heavy on the governor's budget and the June primary, we didn't have room for stuff like that. But it's something that we're always looking to get back to, because it is very important how we're spending our long-term monies on those types of things.
Yeah, on the website, you can search all the polls by keywords. So if you just put in infrastructure, you'll pull up a couple different questions like that.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Yeah, hi. I'm interested in the poverty issues that you raised. And I was wondering if you had done any analysis of your respondents in 2006 versus those that responded now in 2014, and their socioeconomic levels, whether that might factor in, or whether they've experienced any raises, salary increases in the last 12 months, and whether or not that might influence their responses?
That's a good question, and when we're in the heat of the survey, I generally don't have time to think about those types of things, but that would be an interesting thing to look at, to go back and look at the demographics of who was saying it was a big problem in 2006 versus today. We wouldn't have information on whether or not they've had pay raises or things like that, but we could see what their views are on the direction of the state and on the economic future of the state, and see how that crosses with their perceptions of poverty. And of course, we have the demographic information on what their age is, if they what their income bracket is, and things like that as well. So that's a good idea. Yeah.
Or if it's maybe it's the younger respondents, because you said you did a special outreach to some of the younger folks, and whether or not that might also influence their outlook for the future. And I know that that's a big issue, for example, in Europe.
Yeah. No, it's definitely something we'll be coming back to, especially since it's a important topic and one which the Assembly is addressing right now through the EPIC caucus. So it's definitely something we'll be coming back to. And so, yeah.
Other questions?
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for coming, and we'll be here after if there's anything
Yeah,
else.
definitely. Thank you.